Okay, excellent book alert. Let's see if we can do this book justice. Churchill, Walking with Destiny by Andrew Roberts. Wow, this is a book. 1,100 pages, written and presented in a way that is the facts. It leaves it to you to judge the man Winston Churchill. It is a complete biography, covers everything really before his birth until far after his birth. And it's sort of unprecedented. Published October 4th, 2018. It's the first biography written of the 1,009 biographies on Winston Churchill that had access to King George's diaries. Andrew Roberts, went to the location that is secure to read the diaries under surveillance to get notes and research completed for this book. So it's the first time that the diaries from King George have been involved in the writing of a biography, and also the Soviet ambassador Ivan Maisky. And so we reveal a lot of stuff about Churchill in this book that we didn't know before, and it really completes his story. Let me tell you what, Andrew Roberts did a fantastic job. It comes at a time, too, when Churchill is being rewritten in history because of today's politics and the state of the world. I think falsely. My takeaway after reading this book was that he came at a time that was destined. In fact, I have notes here that he sort of felt as if it was his destiny to protect the British Empire from birth. I mean, he wrote something pretty prophetic in his teenage years that indicated that he felt that way early in his life. And so, of course, he was born in the Victorian era, too, where you had a duty to your country. So he kept that philosophy throughout his life. But I will say my biggest takeaway from this book is that had he not come into play and come into power, which he barely got power as an older, I forget the age, it's been so long since I've read this book, but the West would have surrendered to communism, and the world would be completely different if we didn't have Churchill, because the Soviets and the Nazis and these countries over in Eastern Europe just would not have allowed the West to continue if we began negotiating. I think if you watch the movie Darkest Hour, I think if you read this book, I think if you supplement this book and that movie with some YouTube videos where Andrew Roberts does interviews, for example, on the Hoover Institution, go in and YouTube some of that. There's no chance that the War Cabinet had in England to negotiate with Hitler. I mean, Neville Chamberlain and the entire War Cabinet really convinced themselves that they would have favorable terms given from Hitler, and that is just not the case. And so had it not been for Churchill, the western side of the world, the entire West would just be gone as we know it today. And so he really saved the West, which is pretty big to say, but according to the book, I mean, looking at the facts, that's what happened. So, getting into a little bit of the details, he had a career that was all over the place. He switched sides quite a bit, which made a lot of enemies. I actually was able to draw quite a few parallels between, and this is a non-political statement, okay? So whether you're on the left or the right, or your versions of that in England, Churchill is very much like Donald Trump in ways. I mean, they're both sort of rebel outsiders that didn't toe the line and didn't care what others thought of them. And so that gave them a power in operating that others didn't have. Not caring about what people think really opens you up to making leadership decisions that are completely different than what others would that do care about being liked. So he had a career where he was on the left, and then he was on the right, and then he was in the middle, and then he wasn't elected, and then he was. I mean, he was all over the place, and he really didn't bloom into his prime of political career until he was much older. I mean, he was he was advising in Gallipoli, the invasion in World War I, the Great War, through the Straits of Darnell, and he thought if the Royal Navy could get through the Straits of Darnell, they could do sort of a coup over the Turkish defenses at Gallipoli, and it was a total disaster. Like, he went against the world generals, and he suggested that they do these things, and 100 and something thousand soldiers just completely got obliterated at Gallipoli, and that fell on his shoulders. And so going through his career, people would shout at him, what about the Dardanelles? And that's because they thought he was a failed leader. They thought he made poor decisions. And he struggled with that reputation most of his life. And it's unbelievable that he did gain power ultimately, because he really shouldn't have. But it was almost like the errors of others allowed his rise, and he just happened to be there at the right time. And thank goodness, because I'm not sure how many others would have made the decision. He went against his entire war cabinet when it came to negotiating with Hitler. So some things that stuck out to me about this book was how well written it was, how well researched, how unbiased it was put together, because you have the perspective of the notes from the Soviets, who they viewed him privately as somebody that was the alpha and omega of the British Empire. I mean, they had total respect for him at a time where his own people in England had no respect for him, which is very interesting to me. So you had that sort of aspect going on, which is similar to the United States politics today, where you've got the internal that are at odds with Donald Trump. And so you've got this whole sort of similar pattern here of this rebellious attitude. And again, don't get caught up in that comparison as if Donald Trump is Winston Churchill. Not indicating that, but the rebellious behavior and the lack of care about what people thought was very interesting. Now, another thing that was very interesting about Churchill is that he recorded history almost nearly daily. I mean, he took so many notes. He wrote 1,000-page, it's unbelievable if you look at the writings of Churchill. So he recorded quite a bit of history from his perspective through his lens, so that you're able to compare to what historians say happened. So, and Andrew Roberts does a great job showing both sides of that. He was born at Blenheim. His grandfather was the Duke. Perhaps it was his dad. It's been a long time, I forget. But, of course, he had the aristocracy background. Let me look at my notes here, because there's a couple points I want to make. Powerful sense of humor, that is so true. He's passionate, romantic, artistic man, sort of emotional, He would burst into tears at times, almost like he was an empath. Strong, leader, powerful, but also emotional and empathetic as a person. And I think that gave him a degree of compassion for the people. His speeches were iconic. He was a great study of Shakespeare. I mean, he loved the English language, and he would write his speeches in formats that were structured as the Shakespearean plays of the time. And it was, very interesting how he would go out on the radio as it became the new way of communicating, and could just articulate things in such a beautiful oratory that inspired people. And, I mean, people would gather around the radio to hear what he had to say. I will tell you another thing that stuck out to me was during the dark times in London, when they're just being bombarded, okay? He would go out on these rooftops and he would look for these bombs, and he had no fear of being killed or being hit. In fact, he was a soldier, and it's almost like he wanted to die in battle. It's almost like he had a desire to die in a courageous way, because he kept putting himself in these situations, which I find very interesting. There's no fear of death in this man that I could find. All right, so here's the quote that I wrote down that's fascinating, and you probably found fascinating if you read this book as well. I have a feeling, this is when he's young now. I think he's in school still. I have a feeling that a great event will come to pass, and that I shall be called upon to play a decisive part in it. I have a conviction that I am destined to achieve something in the future. Wow. I mean, and now the whole thesis of the book, sort of by Andrew Roberts, is based on that quote. I mean, walking with destiny. Andrew's argument to a degree is because he had this belief in his destiny, it shaped his drive and his perseverance and his ability to decision make in these hard times when it was just him that thought a certain way. But because it was his destiny and he had this savior complex regarding the British Empire, it allowed him to make those decisions. So I mean, what a fascinating statement by him, and a very high degree of self-awareness. I think one thing that he did very well, which some of the great leaders do, as I pick up in reading these biographies, is they have an extremely high degree of self-awareness. Okay, they know their strengths and their weaknesses precisely, and I think that's what helps them determine where to position themselves in times of leadership. Without that self-awareness, I don't think they would be nearly as successful as they are. Here's another quote I wrote down. It is not enough to have lived. We should be determined to live for something. May I suggest that it be creating joy for others, sharing what we have for the betterment of personhood, bringing hope to the lost and love to the lonely. I mean, what a quote here. One of his most famous speeches on May 10th, 1940, he says, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." I mean, that to me is, how can you foreshadow that? Okay, I mean, it's almost as if he was put here to do this work at this particular time. Another thing I found fascinating was the Yalta Conference. You know, Churchill said he trusted the Soviets' word. Privately, he says the same thing. He believed he could trust them about Poland, but then over the next 53 weeks, a lot happens in Poland that changes his mind, where the Russians put 1,000,000 boots on the ground. The West sort of couldn't do anything at that point. And what do? Declare war against the Soviets? This is at the Yalta Conference. This is where he takes some heat. He just gave Poland over to the Soviets. Look, the case Andrew Roberts lays out is, what do you want him to do? Do you want him to declare war on the Soviets as soon as World War II is over? I mean, every resource has been depleted. They're in financial chaos. What can you do? It's almost like just a negative byproduct of ending World War II was the loss of Poland. I mean, you know, what do you expect? So when he makes the Iron Curtain speech, you know, of course, Parliament attacks him, and we go back to pre-war times where people just almost the Parliament people shun Churchill even after everything. Now the people stick with him. Now, what I thought was interesting too was another argument he makes about FDR and the end of his life. Was he naive of the Russians? Did the war effort just bring them together? Because Churchill and FDR had an interesting relationship. And again, he makes the case that the only alternative is to confront them, and I don't know if it's realistic. So the ones that criticize him for allowing the Soviets to take Poland, I mean, it's not like he made the deal for them to go in there. But he just trusted their word. I mean, they'd been through so much together. The Soviets give the most casualties and death of any force in the entire World War II. So why would you expect them to not keep their word at that point? You know, and you almost have to do that anyway. I mean, if you believe they're liars, you're going to have to kind of accept that anyway, because there's no alternative. So, all right, finally, I have on here, Andrew Roberts wrote the book without research assistance, which I thought was crazy. I mean, you know the amount of research he would have had to done for this book. Did it all himself. And he was at the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle in the Round Tower, reading those diaries for this book under surveillance and security. When he went to the bathroom there at Windsor Castle, somebody went with him. So he was one of these rare biographers, these authors that got access to those diaries and was able to put this together in 2018, and it's fascinating. This was the 1,110th book written on Winston Churchill, Andrew Roberts' fifth. He spent 30 years researching Winston Churchill. He does say one sentence about Churchill that history will remember him by. He said, "Never give in. Never, never, never give in." He says it's the reason that we're not speaking German today and why the world is mostly democratic today. I kind of draw the same conclusion, because there was nothing in Churchill's favor. You know, the Battle of Dunkirk, when those troops get stranded on the beach, the entire war cabinet says it's time to surrender and begin negotiations, because they are going to obliterate the soldiers. The fact that he's able to get civilians to do a mass evacuation off this beach is nearly a miracle. So would anybody else in his position make these decisions? And would they save the empire? I don't think so. And then you have to ask yourself, what would it look like had they negotiated with Hitler? Is there any realistic person that believes that they would have been given favorable terms and somehow thrived under Hitler's communism? You have to ask yourself that question. All right, so that's the book, Churchill Walking with Destiny, Andrew Roberts. Fascinating. He's got another book about Napoleon that I'm very excited to read. This was, again, 1,100 pages, huge read. Would I read it again? Absolutely I would. And I don't say that much about books. You guys know that. So really, really fascinating. Another thing I would recommend is as you go through this book, look up the speeches that are quoted in the book. There are quite a few of his speeches during wartime, pre-wartime, and after that are great listens on YouTube. And for the ones that have video, pretty unbelievable to watch these speeches. Especially V-Day on YouTube you can watch. And when you watch it, as you read it, very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. Really brings the book to life. All right, Churchill, Walking with Destiny, Andrew Roberts.